King, the permanent representative of St. Vincent and the Grenadines to the United Nations. So distinguished heads of government and states, foreign ministers, ambassadors, colleagues, friends, a very warm welcome to all of you. The permanent mission of St. Vincent and the Grenadines is very pleased that you have joined us today for the launch of Prime Minister Gonsalves' latest book, A Time of Respair Beyond COVID, Volcanic Eruptions, Hurricane Elsa, and Global Turmoil, Fresh Hope for St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Dr. Gonsalves has been Prime Minister of St. Vincent and the Grenadines since 2001, for more than 21 years. He is also the author of numerous books, more than 9 now, I believe, Prime Minister, the latest of which grapples with the challenges and possibilities of the small island developing state. The launch of this important and timely publication will take place against the backdrop of a conversation between two Caribbean luminaries. Prime Minister Gonsalves is joined by Sir Hilary Beckles, Vice-Chancellor of the University of the West Indies, who has been the Vice-Chancellor since 2015. He is also Chairman of the Caribbean Reparations Commission and also the author of numerous books. Instead of reading extensive CVs of these two intellectual giants of our Caribbean civilization, I will describe each using the others, the words of the other. So, in 2010, actually, Prime Minister Gonsalves published a book entitled The Making of the Comrade, The Political Journey of Ralph Gonsalves. In the preface of that book, which was written by Sir Hilary, here is how Sir Hilary described his friend and colleague, Prime Minister Gonsalves. And I read directly from the prologue. I have long been of the opinion that the Caribbean civilization is rather like the rainforest. In it resides, not hidden, but unseen, all the clues and glues to the future of our social condition. Light and nothing else will reveal its insights. Enter the turbulent spirit we call the comrade. A beam so bright, it pierces the canopy and brings life to the remotest recesses where dwell the threatened fauna. No one, since Dr. Eric Williams, has departed the academy and delved so deeply into the polity and with such haste and good taste. Caribbean people have no time. The comrade knows this well, as did earlier captains of the federal ships. We are rushing to distance ourselves from the colonial scaffold erected by those who served the interests of Admiral Columbus, who crashed and corrupted these shores. We need speed and sharp minds to read how to take us away from the aura of backwardness bequeathed. Prime Minister Gonsalves is determined to detach these dozens of desperate villages from a history of pillages that have left them with persistent poverty as the primary legacy. There has been and can be no better preparation of a disciple, fed on the finest fiber of frenzied mind at Mona, the first Caribbean rainforest, his pedigree rooted in the laboring history of the migratory Portuguese poor was revealed and bloomed, as did the Pui in spring, nurtured on New World thought, sweetened with the sensation of social justice, and moved to action in the fiery furnace of 68. A new man emerged for a mission to speak for this Caribbean civilization. At a book launch of Britain's Black Debt, Reparations for Caribbean Slavery and Native Genocide by Sir Hilary Beckles on May 3rd, 2013, in Kingston, Jamaica, sponsored by the University of the West Indies Press, here is what Prime Minister Gonsalves, aka the Comrade, had to say about Sir Hilary and this magnificent publication. Beckles writes in a refreshing, compelling style. His narrative conveys the hard-nosed historian's affinity for facts from which truths are inexorably derived. His conceptual clarity on the subject of reparations for slavery and native genocide reflects a razor-sharp mind which is among the best globally in his business. His trade of historical research and writing. Beckles writes with commitment to truth and justice. He evinces, too, a passionate intensity which brings out the best in a seasoned child of our Caribbean civilization, not as a propagandist, but as an experienced student of Caribbean historiography who has a duty to speak for his native antecedents and enslaved forebears, and to seek just recompense for their descendants. To borrow the language of George Lamming, our revered seer and creative genius, Beckles glows with a brightness which is illuminating, not blinding. Everton Weekes was cricket's master craftsman, with whom Beckles collaborated in his autobiography. Beckles, in his Britain's Black Debt, puts on a display of self-mastery in seeking to right historical wrongs, which confirms him as the Caribbean's most scholarly, impressive, and influential public intellectual. So, enough said. No need for the CV. But before we begin our conversation this evening, allow me to just elaborate the flow of segments. The first part of the conversation between Prime Minister Gonsalves and Sir Hilary Beckles will, we estimate, to last about 25 minutes, after which our distinguished guests can signal their desire to join the conversation by posing a question or making a comment. Now, you can do this in two ways. You can come up, I'm going to sit there, and you can come up to the podium and join the conversation. It's a small crowd. It won't be unruly, I'm sure. And or you can raise your hand and a colleague in the room will pass the mic to you. Before I hand over to Sir Hilary, Prime Minister, to kick off the conversation, a question was posed in the RSVP. I don't know if the person is in the house with us this evening, but the question was posed, and I give it to Sir Hilary to launch the conversation. Our anonymous guest said this: Dr. Gonsalves, at a time of the great reckoning and reconciling our colonial past, why was it important for you to resurrect an old or obsolete English word as part of the title of your new book? With that, I cede the floor to Sir Hilary to begin the conversation. But if you must leave before the book signing, please feel free to take a copy It's a gift from the Honorable Prime Minister, Dr. Ralph Gonsalves.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. What a tremendous joy and privilege it is to be here at this historic moment to engage my friend and my brother in a conversation about the context and content of his latest book. Now, I too, like many of you, Googled this afternoon the word Respair. And Google says, it did at about 3 o'clock this afternoon, Google said, Respair is the word of the day. The word of the day. By Google today, the word of the day. It's a 16th century word. It said, that is the opposite of despair. Now, Prime Minister Gonsalves is my brother and my mentor. Now, he is not my mentor in the sense that I wish to become a prime minister. It is the most difficult and impossible job in the Caribbean. And I have maximum respect for all of our prime ministers who are here, because we Caribbean people are not easy to manage. But he is my friend, as we would say in this country. He's my brother from another mother. And you don't get closer than that. But Ralph has been an intellectual leader. When I first met him at the university in Barbados, he was the leading public intellectual of that time. And all of us who came after him aspired to walk in his footsteps, to be a thinker, to be a public advocate for social justice and development, to be a writer. And he took all of those legacies and thought it better to serve his people as a prime minister than a professor. So he has left me behind to deal with the professorial issues while he served our people as a prime minister. Now, I wish to put my first salvo, so to speak, so that Ralph can lay the foundation for the context of this book. In the frontispiece of the monograph, there is a section called Poetic Reflections. Now, he is a political scientist, a political economist, a sociologist, a literary critic, a lawyer. What does he know about poetic reflections? He's a philosopher. The question is, therefore, Ralph, tell us about this commitment to the poetic, to the spiritual, to the philosophical, that laid the foundation for your authorship of this very important and seminal work.
Thanks very much. And I want to thank everyone for coming out this evening. I know you have many other important things to do, and those of you who are here with us, I really appreciate it. Distinguished audience, my colleague prime ministers and others. The Caribbean, including St. Vincent and the Grenadines, we have gone through a very difficult period. COVID came upon us like a veritable thief in the night on March the 11th, 2020. And then in the case of several of us, several countries, natural disasters accompanied this period. In the case of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, last year, April, we had 32 volcanic eruptions where we had to evacuate 1/5 of our population. Then we had, in July of that year, the first Atlantic hurricane in the Caribbean. Hurricane Elsa struck us. Then we had a short drought thereafter. And then, of course, in February this year, February the 24th, the quote-unquote special military operation was launched into Ukraine by the Russian Federation. And all these factors, all of them, against the backdrop of the tremendous limitations and weaknesses, at the same time possibilities and strengths of our countries, and against the historical legacies of underdevelopment brought about in part by native genocide, the enslavement of African bodies, and awful colonialism, and the contemporary contradictions in the political economy, climate change, and everything else. And we've been this way before. Dominica, 2017, Grenada, 2004, where the entire GDP of our countries were wiped out. And the mantra coming out from Washington, from the World Bank, the IMF, we must build back better and stronger. And that was adopted in Dominica, it's adopted in Grenada and other places. And I was reflecting on this, that there has to be something more than building back better and stronger. Something far more existential, which touches the spirit and the soul. In addition to building back the infrastructure and creating the jobs and the like. And I began to reflect very much on language. And the word came that this really is a time of Respair, of fresh hope, after a period of convulsion, dislocation, of even despair. And fresh hope is concomitant with two other values, virtues in our Judeo-Christian tradition, that of faith made perfect in works, and love, which is an ever-fixed mark that looks on tempests and is never shaken. And this word Respair gave the connotation of all of these things put together. So it's not just building back better or stronger. It is something deeper, something far more existential.
You know,
and it turned me, and this is where I linked it with the poetic expressions. There's a poet from St. Vincent and the Grenadines, now dead. You find his work in several anthologies on Caribbean poetry, Danny Williams. In a poem called We Are the Cenotaph, he said, "We are all time. Yet, only the future is ours to desecrate. The present is the past. And the past, our fathers' mischiefs. And it does not speak at all to lamentations. It speaks to resilience. It speaks to optimism, what is best in us." And in the book, in the poetic expressions section, in addition to what I quoted on Daniel Williams, and also the Mexican poet laureate Octavia Paz, there is the reference to the song "Great is Thy Faithfulness," that hymn, which comes from the book of Lamentations written by Job, which is not really a book about lamentations. It's a book about hope, really, of the Jewish people who are in bondage, who are in difficulties, who are in turmoil. Morning by morning, new mercies we see. All that we need, thy hand had provided. Great is thy faithfulness. So that is the context philosophically.
Yes.
And therefore, in the valley, we had to prepare the way as to when the circumstances are propitious to make the ascent up the mountainside to see how
Yes.
we can respair. Fresh hope.
And of course, the significance of that is to always ask the question, how do our political leaders find the faith, the courage, and the confidence to face a history of impossibility? Because when you look at the history of our Caribbean world, which is the most exploited part of the modern world, the genocide of the native people, 300 years of slavery, colonization, racial apartheid, almost every sin you can imagine was a critical part of the Caribbean world. And then we entered independence. And the British government refused to give us a development strategy, a development plan, no investment. All of our prime ministers went to England to discuss a development strategy. And they were told, there's no development strategy. You are on your own. So, Prime Minister, you come to office against a political background of being on your own to clean up the colonial mess that we have all inherited. But you have had to find the courage, the confidence, and the faith to confront it, to make headway, to defeat it, and to triumph. Tell us about that consciousness and that commitment.
Well, I think Osemati wrote in his very famous essay in 1891, entitled Our America, Cuban Patriot and Revolution. He said, weapons of the mind vanquish all others. Very simple statement. And we in the Caribbean have thrown up bundles of extraordinary ideas to help to guide us. Some of them come from Hillary, and some of that is inside of this book. From Walter Rodney. There's a discussion in the book about development ideas from Marcus Garvey through Arthur Lewis, both in his articulation, in his own words, and from those who sought to caricature Arthur Lewis. But there's a difference between Arthur Lewis himself and what he has written, and those who are not as formidable minds who caricature and simplify his work, the profundity of his work. Into Eric Williams and Michael Manley and the New World Group with Lloyd Bess and C.Y. Thomas and the Marxist left, Trevor Monroe, Bernard Cord, ideas about the non-capitalist path to development. How do we use advanced social democracy? All of these ideas have a discussion to look at the possibilities and limitations of them, and to see, as we arrive at this particular juncture in this post-colonial period, what do we do? And the broad rubric in which we sought to distill ideas in relation to economic development, and which I sought to do in the book, is to say that we have to embark on a paradigm shift from the colonial or the amended colonial economy to what I call the quest to build a modern, competitive, many-sided post-colonial economy, which is at once national, regional, and global. And each of those words is pregnant with meaning. Because the colonial and amended colonial economy had at its foundation certain features. The one you described, you talked about earlier, about when we arrived at independence. What were among these features? First, the colonial and amended colonial economy was based on unlimited supplies of unskilled labor priced at a low level. Very low technology. Subsidies at home or market preferences abroad, whether it's for sugar or bananas. Well, all those things came to an end. And there's a gaping hole because no one was prepared, or at least none of the societies were properly prepared at the time of independence to confront these things. So we have to now construct an economy which is modern, which involves advanced science and technology, which is competitive. Nobody owes us any living fillip. Which is many-sided, and it's national, it's regional, thus mature regionalism, and it's global. And that is based, and has to be based, on unlimited supplies of skilled labor and knowledge, priced at a particular level of the division of labor internationally, with higher levels of technology and applied technology. And we have to sell our goods and our services, including tourism services, in a competitive manner with a quality and everything to survive. And what we are about, we have to do it nationally, and we have to do it regionally and globally. Of course, there are other parallel tracks. That is the economic frame on which the state, the private sector, and the cooperative sector have important roles, which I delineated in the book and give a lot of examples in our case in St. Vincent and the Grenadines and other parts of the Caribbean. But critically, all of this has to be seen once we are Respair, and within the context that we are a civilization. Mm-hmm. We are an authentic civilization, this Caribbean civilization. It is sui generis. It is an island civilization or a seaboard civilization in the case of Guyana or Suriname or Belize. It has an authenticity, and it has a trajectory for further development and ennoblement. Yes. And as I say metaphorically, this civilization in our peculiar landscape and seascape, that we are metaphorically the songs of the indigenous people, the Kalinago, the Garifuna, the Amerindian. We are the rhythm of Africa. We are the melody of Europe. We are the chords of Asia. And we are the homegrown lyrics of the Caribbean. Of course, this metaphoric symphony, like all symphonies, you have dissonances. But those dissonances are dealt with. We have evolved institutional, cultural, anthropological forms and legal structures to address these dissonances. And we are building viable societies with the economic base I'm talking about in a democratic framework. And we can teach the world about tolerance and how to live together with different ethnicities and so forth. And we are facing so many exogenous challenges. These challenges are not of our own making. And we have to come to terms with them strategically while keeping body and soul together of people, and to make sure that there's a level of life, living, and production which is satisfactory for everybody. And that is what the story is about. I mean, I know, because I'm in the middle of my 5th term, somebody must be saying that, Ralph, you're making it sound as though it's your last will and testament, but it's not. It's not that at all. It's just that I thought it necessary and desirable to put some of these things down on paper in this especially difficult period.
And Prime Minister, ladies and gentlemen, the book is perfectly titled, because when you read this book, there isn't an element of despair anywhere, despite all of the challenges that we Caribbean people are faced with. And the challenges are rising at an incredible rate. We have the climate change, we have the COVID, we have the chronic diseases, and we have all of these mountain challenges. But in this book, you feel a pathway to persistent struggle, confidence, and faith. And the importance of all of this is to explain why the Prime Minister is arguably one of the greatest statesmen of the Western world, because any Prime Minister in a robust democratic environment who wins the confidence of the people year after year after year, that is an extraordinary achievement. And we have to, especially in the Caribbean, in the Caribbean, we hold our leaders to a very high standard. And I'm from a country that has just given the Prime Minister Barbados every seat, every constituency, because that was the belief. We have a Prime Minister who has had an unprecedented historic commitment from his people.
Hillary, the difference between me and myself, I don't need, all I need is just one vote more than the other side. That's all I need.
But what I wanted, where I wanted to take this conversation was here. When you go through this book, you can see why the Prime Minister has been so successful, because there is a section in this book where he describes how national institutions had to be refashioned. Insurance, public insurance, the police force, the banking system, the insurance system, transportation, all of the institutions that are required to allow the citizens to live in an orderly and effective fashion. And you get a sense of a Prime Minister whose sleeve is rolled up, not just to develop a national framework, not just a national vision, but down in the trenches in every village and every community, building up those community institutions to allow democracy to function. And I want to ask the Prime Minister, how is it possible, how is it humanly possible to be developing national strategic plans and also down in the villages and the communities, talking to institutional leaders about building up national institutions to allow the democracy to function?
Well, I think that if we do not have the institutions for good governance, and I know that's a word which has all sorts of different connotations, we are not going to be building orderly societies in the interests of people. And as young democracies, Hillary, we have to build these institutions. In the book, I describe what we have done with the Office of the Attorney General, with the Director of Public Prosecution, the Director of Audit, some places called the Director General of Audit, or the Auditor General. The big state institutions, the National Insurance Services, they're simple things. Like we have the financial year for the National Insurance Services, which is our largest institution from the standpoint of its assets outside of the central government. The financial year runs January 1st to December 31st. By June, July of the following year, I must have the audited accounts of the National Insurance Services in my hand to lay in Parliament. Because unless you have that, the workers are not going to know what's happening to their money. And that's vital for them. You can't allow that social security system. If anything is going wrong, they must know it's going wrong and what we are doing to correct it, what all of us are doing to correct it. We own the electricity services. The same thing happened to the accounts electricity services. Water, the National Telecommunications Regulatory Commission, the important institutions of the outside of the central government, but where, as both Phillips know, of the Bahamas and of St. Lucia, and my dear sister, the Prime Minister from St. Martin, that these institutions are critical for the orderly life and living, the quality of life of our people, and there must be some predictability. In fact, in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, I call on the opposition all the time to hold Public Accounts Committee meetings. I want the Public Accounts Committee to hold their meetings. It's chaired by the leader of the opposition. I want to be able to answer any questions because it's not my business, it's the people's business. And it's good, of course, if they ask you the questions, that you have favorable answers, and we tend to have favorable answers. So that helps very much. But it means that everybody who's working in the system knows that they have to answer these questions. And the truth of the matter is this: those of us who lead, and I suspect the same thing happening in the Bahamas and happening in St. Lucia and St. Martin. And my Minister of Foreign Affairs here would tell you, inside of the cabinet, I am a big critic of the government. I ask questions all the time and demand answers. Because if you don't, things are going to come off, the wheels are going to come off the government. And in Respair, all these things have to be done properly. Mm-hmm. We have our challenges, we have our weaknesses, and it is far from perfect. But the citizens must know that you're seeking to make these institutions work and work properly and work for them. Mm-hmm. And this is why I spent a lot of time in the book with about 30 important institutions. I discussed them as to what correctives we have made and what we still need to do. Because as you say, Hillary, you can have all the theoretical formulae and you can have the broad framework. but you got to make the train run on time. And that is part and parcel of creating the sense of fresh hope. It has to be grounded in institutions.
And that sense of fresh hope, Prime Minister, I think I want to ask you to elaborate on what I consider to be your latest masterstroke. When a Prime Minister gives up the portfolio of Ministry of Finance to become the Minister for Higher Education. Now that is a masterstroke because it has never happened before anywhere in the Caribbean. And that has to be rooted in a conception of development that requires a certain kind of intervention on your part.
Well, I gave up the Ministry of Foreign Finance a little earlier. I gave up specifically, quite recently, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and took on the ministry responsible, the portfolio, hived it off from education for post-secondary and tertiary education, for higher education. Well, it fits in. If we have to build if we are in the process, and we are indeed in the process of building a modern, competitive, many-sided, post-colonial economy, education, science, technology, skills, they're critical. Absolutely. And in the same way that I am Minister of National Preparedness, Disaster Preparedness, I have to be to give this drive to higher education, because that's where a lot of what happens in the future, and particularly for young males. You and I were talking about this. 70% of the persons who are in community colleges and universities across the Caribbean are females. And Hillary and I were talking and drawing an analogy from cricket. We are champions at under 19. And we compete robustly with all the teams all over the world up to under 19. But the same names whom we beat at under 19, all of them, Australia, New Zealand, India, England, all of them beat us when the 19-year-old become 25. What is happening between 17, 18, 19, and 25? And maybe the future of our civilization hinges to a great deal as to answering that particular query and put things, Fred, in place to address that particular conundrum. And I've been giving this a great deal of thought. Of course, as you would expect, in some of our societies, what passes for commentary. Oh, he has taken it because he doesn't have confidence in the Minister of Education. I mean, I have full confidence in the Minister of Education. There's a lot of rubbish when people talk like that. They don't see the strategic question that over the next 3 years, there's a plan. There is, and I've been meeting with the people at the community college, the post-secondary institutions. And I will attend the university council meetings, and I will take a greater part in the University of the West Indies, because I want to have some ideas and I want to learn more about what is taking place, so that we have to get this right. We spend a lot of money. And I'm sure that while I'm talking, the two Philips may well be saying, maybe this is something we should look at a little bit more critically, because we tend to get very much involved in early childhood education, primary, secondary, special education, technical centers, technical institutes to deal with plumbers and carpenters and masons and the like. But very often, we leave the community colleges, the post-secondary institutions, and the universities essentially to run themselves. And maybe while I believe that we have to allow the academics to get on and do their teaching how they want to do their teaching and so on and so forth, but there has to be some clear policy guidance. So I was reflecting on the cricketing point we were making, and that is what informed that particular decision, really.
And I can tell you, Prime Minister, as the Vice Chancellor of the University of the West Indies, there's nothing I would love more, my colleagues and I, than to see some of our Prime Ministers attend our council meetings. We miss that intimacy of dialogue with our leaders. We do miss it, and we would benefit from that. But I want, Prime Minister, to ask you about the uniqueness of your position as a Caribbean Prime Minister at this moment in history, especially in these changing circumstances in the world, the situation in relation to Venezuela, the situation in the Ukraine, the situation, the continued hostility to Cuba. But you have maintained more or less a kind of intellectual, non-aligned kind of vision, a south vision of development. You have consistently said it is not for me to be a victim of a certain kind of global politic. We have to build capacity across the South. We have to build capacity between progressive nations and so on. And I want to congratulate you on your receiving the highest national honor from the government and people of Cuba for your integrity in that regard. Tell us how you have continued to chart a path to suggest that these volatilities, they come and go. But it's important for the Caribbean to understand that it is part of a southern world of Latin America, Asia, Africa. It's not just north-south, it's south-south, and we have to read that circumstance and proceed accordingly.
Well, you know, Hilary, I discussed this question in the book also.
Yeah.
A lot of our people in the Caribbean, they think that foreign policy is a luxury. They think that what it is, there's a lot of diplomats who you have in London and Washington and New York living high on the hog, and that you travel hither and thither to this or that meeting with no significance. Well, they happen just to be plain wrong, because the expenditure on foreign policy, if you look at the budgets for the various governments, is very small as a percentage of expenditure overall, and the benefits derived from the foreign policy, purely in dollar terms, way in excess of what you spend. But it is not a transactional matter in that way. If you're a small country, you have to utilize all the instruments of your sovereignty and independence, far more so than if you are China or the United States of America. Those countries can be isolationists, and they have been at various times. But we can't afford that. We have to be engaging all the time with a world, an external environment, which, broadly speaking, is hostile to us. However how many nice words would be said. Even when you have a rules-based regime, the rules are tilted against you. And even if, as Antigua has shown, you take a country to an international tribunal, as they did take the United States of America on an issue concerning internet gaming, The Antiguans won the case and the Americans ain't pay up yet. So the point is this, the rules of the game are important, and we have to make those rules fairer. And we have to engage with our external environment in such a manner that we put the interests of our own humanization at a high premium. And we have to enhance our capacity to deal more capably with the external environment in the interest of our people's humanization. And there are some fundamental propositions which arise since the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. Equality of states, though the Security Council, where they have permanent members, some are more equal than others. Non-interference, non-intervention, peaceful settlement of disputes, multilateralism, all these are foundation stones of the foreign policy of St. Vincent and Grenadines and the rest of the CARICOM countries. We are agreed on all of these things. And you listen to our speeches at the United Nations, and though we may have a variation on this or that issue here and there, as you would expect, different countries would have different emphases. But you take our positions on climate change, our position on reparations and native genocide and enslavement of Africans, the construction of a multi-dimensional vulnerability index, the question of to supplement the inadequate per capita GDP index, the matter of loss and damage as a consequence of climate change. They come to us from outside, the loss and the damage, they hit us. All of these things, we are marching together. We are on the same track. Of course, some may be more willing to make a compromise here than a compromise there. Well, that is in the nature of things. But foreign policy for small states is of inestimable value. And anybody who thinks otherwise simply would like to be a colony.
Madam Chair, I think I might be ready to hand you back the baton. I'm sure that members of the audience have some questions they would wish to put to the Prime Minister. You've been very patient. Thank you.
I think that they're enjoying this conversation quite a bit.
Yes.
I will, however, offer the opportunity, should they desire so to do. You can come to the podium, or we can, any takers? Is anyone, I know perhaps no one has read the book yet, but has anything that has been said thus far, teased out a question from you? Feel free to interrupt. I'm going to hand it back to Sir Hilary to continue, because I think he has many more things he would like to ask the Honorable Prime Minister. But should you want to, please raise your hand.
Yes. Okay.
Rhonda, I'll say this. Hilary is quite modest about something in relation to the book. Hilary wrote a book earlier, sometime last year. And I made reference to it several times. It's in the bibliography here. How Britain Underdeveloped the Caribbean, a Reparations Response to Europe's Legacy of Plunder. And part of the book, dealing with reparations and the advance of social democracy, borrows importantly from Hilary's work, and we have to build upon all that work. But the craft of the historian is critical for our appreciation as to where we are. I am part of a discussion in the book about what happened between 1881 and 1831 in St. Vincent and the Grenadines? 50 years. You think we have had problems? When you look at that 50-year period, in 1881, the sugar industry collapsed. In 1898, the worst hurricane ever to hit our country blew down all the sugar mills and all the remaining sugar mills and the arrowroot factories. 1902, the volcanic eruption, which killed 2,000 persons, and which our volcanic eruption was at this, our series about the same level as 1902. Not one person was killed. 2,000 were killed in 1902. Then arrowroot and sugar collapsed. Cotton became king for about 10 years in the early 20th century. Sea Island cotton. Then the World War, 1914, 1918. The Spanish flu, which while we didn't get the same effects to our health as COVID, it affected the world economy and affected us badly. 1926, another big hurricane. 1929 to 1931, the global economic depression. 50-year period. The colonial state did little or nothing when you look at the history. And there are a lot of historical work, including on St. Vincent by Dr. Cleve Scott, who has written a thesis. He's a lecturer in history at the University of the West Indies. The state did very little, but interestingly, the ordinary people sought to deal with their circumstances in those 50 years. Through migration, migration was huge. Not only to other Caribbean countries, but to Panama, to Costa Rica, even to Brazil. And people became self-organizing. Friendly societies, benevolent societies, agricultural credit societies, an agricultural credit bank of a cooperative nature. In other words, people responded in that time in this way to deal with these challenges. We, of course, we have a high level of technology, we have independence, we have a more educated population, we have our foreign policy, we have other instruments to do other things, but it is very interesting to note how they sought to come to terms with what was 50 years of real misery. So you see, if we think we have 2 years of misery, you should look at particular periods in your own history and be able to draw lessons, yes, and therefore fresh hope.
Because the challenge, Prime Minister, is that we recognize that the Caribbean, since independence, has had to fund its development through debt.
Absolutely.
And that has been the challenge, that after 300 years of colonial extraction by Europe, the islands became independent, inherited a tremendously broken infrastructure, institutions that were inadequate, inefficient, and they were told to go and develop. I believe, and this is the point we're making, is that Caribbean leaders have done a remarkable job in converting these colonies into stable democracies.
Absolutely.
That was an enormous achievement to have these broken colonial structures and transform them into sovereign democratic nations. But then they were told that, you're on your own, and therefore they had to fund their basic development, schools, hospitals, roads, bridges. They had to fund that with debt. And now the Caribbean is the most indebted part of the world because they were abandoned and left to fund basic infrastructural development through debt. So the question is, where do we go from here? Because we cannot continue deepening ourselves into debt just to meet basic operational requirements. And the question is, does Europe that extracted so much wealth from these islands over 300-400 years, including 300 years of free labor. 300 years of free labor from 20 million people. If you compute that, if you get 300 years of free labor from 20 million people, and we have computed that, it's trillions of dollars. And the argument, therefore, is, should you not ethically be required to put back even a small percentage of that into development projects? And Europe has consistently said, no, we are not putting back any of that into development for the region. So that is our conundrum. That's where we are.
I mean, 2 university professors. Fortunately, I went to KV at some time in my life. So I'm very proud to say I went to school with these 2 gentlemen. Well, what I want to do is to just congratulate Comrade Ralph. Ralph is one of the most unique people I've met. Sometimes I try to say to myself, where did he get his memory from? Ralph can quote from the Bible, King James Version. Then he goes to the Quran, and he comes back and he quotes Arthur Lewis and Eric Williams and now Beckles. This guy has a phenomenal brain. A brain that, I say to myself, I wonder. And to win elections and become prime minister of a country for 25 years, 23?
Well, 21 and a half. Thus far, Philip.
I have been prime minister for a year, and it's too much. And this guy has done it for 21 years. So I want to really congratulate Ralph and tell him he must always give these lessons to young intellectuals. What concerns me as a prime minister is why my school, the University of West Indies, hasn't worked out an economic theory that allows us to deal with the IMF and the structural adjustment, etc. It really irks me. And I think this is I'm really concerned when I have to discuss. Like, I have an instance where I'm looking for $60 million from the World Bank. $60 million. EC dollars, which really is minuscule. And I have to go into fiscal rules. All sorts of things that will make my people poorer. Why haven't we found a system in our region, all the intellectuals of our region and great intellectuals, why haven't we found a way to deal with the issues that confront us in terms of our economy? And why do we always have to be back to the structural adjustment, IMF programs? I'm wondering if it's because our regional integration movement is not strong enough. Well, if we were one country, if we had one currency and the EC dollar, to which Ralph had a good big part to play in ensuring that the Monetary Council is a solid organization, why are we not able to remove what I can call the bondage from ourselves of these institutions?
Philip, you raise an interesting question. And yes. Hillary, I think part of the answer lies in, well, there are 2 parts of the answer. Among others, no doubt. First, Caribbean economics has evolved devoid of the history of economic thought and devoid of comparative economic history. Unless we understand comparative economic history and the history of economic thought, what you end up with is economics, modern economics, is a set of theoretical postulates which do not have a grounding philosophically and which do not have an idea of comparative economic history. It's like it becomes purely a series of technical functions. The study of economics is a series of technical functions. I think that is a big weakness, and I would say that. And secondly, we need to have a process in which, as happens in the developed world, that people move between academia and the private sector and the state sector. And the university must have some flexibility to allow them to come into the government and go back into the academic world, go into the private sector and come back. We have here a brother, Arthur Mirante, who is married to a relative of mine and who is from the rural community in St. Vincent. She's here, but Arthur is a businessman, he's a lawyer, and he's involved with St. John's University, Catholic University here in New York City. And he will understand the point I'm making very well about the movement of lecturers, intellectuals from academia to the private sector and to government, and get a lot of practical know-how and understanding of issues. The economists who come from UWI, who come to work in my government, in our government, I give them books on the history of economic thought. I give them books on comparative economic history. I tell them read these things before they start to work, because I know what they require. You look at Arthur Lewis's work. They're works of ideas. And economic history, comparative economic history, and much of it. Thanks, Philip.
And I would add, Prime Ministers, there is no part of the modern world that has been subject to more rigorous economic analysis than the Caribbean in the last 60 years or so. And the University of the West Indies has produced generations of economic thought and practice and policies. Now, Ralph made reference to Arthur Lewis. Arthur Lewis, when he was our Vice Chancellor, was developing a view of Caribbean economic development that was innovative, relevant, strategic, but it became the subject of critical discourse by another generation.
Absolutely.
That felt it was too dependent oriented on the North Atlantic. And they wanted a different kind of economics. And thus we had the New World School, we have the plantation economy, and that body of economics had a tremendous impact on the modernization of the Caribbean. But then there was another generation of economists who also critiqued that. The monetarists came on board, and when we had the conversations about the IMF, what to do. Should we embrace the IMF? Should we reject the IMF? And the community of economists were split down the middle on that. I was living in Jamaica when Jamaica embraced the IMF and became the poster boy of the IMF. Then I moved to Barbados, and Barbados rejected the IMF with its own body of economics and developed its own indigenous solutions. But I will say to you that the problem, from my perspective, is that the region have been caught in a dichotomy. There's an energy that is demanding social justice. There's an energy that's demanding economic growth. And the the political leadership is generally having a difficult time riding these two horses in the same race. How do you foreground in national policy social justice? How do you pivot to economic justice? And this is why I think this book is so critical, because this is the book that shows how to marry those two forces into one narrative. But on the whole, generally in the region, most of the countries are polarized in terms of this narrative. Yeah. And it produces a kind of economics where you're either a social justice economist because you want the distribution of wealth, you are anti-poverty, you want less poverty, you want to empower the poor, you want to restructure the distribution of wealth, you want to have more people brought into the economy, and there's that group of economics. Then you have the other group that says all we have to do is attract big capital from the North Atlantic, big investments, big capital projects, bring in some investments from other countries to create jobs, and that will solve the problem. But that has not solved the problem when it was applied. So what we need, I believe, right now, Prime Ministers, is, again, to follow the prescription here in this book, which is to find that strategy and that skill to marry the social justice expectations of the people with the importance of economic growth, and find a way to manage them into a national strategic plan. That, it seems to me, is the problem.
Yeah. Well, I'll leave it for somebody else.
Thank you very much, Philip.
Thank you, Prime Minister.
How does St. Vincent and the Grenadines navigate foreign policy in an arena which they might be used as a pawn in political conflicts between superpowers? Are they in any position to deny or refuse relationship with one nation at risk of upsetting another?
It's an important question. I want to answer you by saying this. In the mid-19th century, the British Foreign Secretary, Lord Palmerston, at the time of the Crimean War, by the way, there was a Crimean War in the mid-19th century. Not just the first time with Putin, you know. There was one before that. And he said famously in the British House of Commons, Britain has no permanent friends nor permanent enemies, only permanent interests. Well, our foreign policy is not as utilitarian as that. Because while we have our own interests, we have fundamental principles on which we govern our foreign policy. They're laid down in the Charter of the United Nations. And when we made our run for the Security Council and became the smallest country ever to become a member of the Security Council, non-permanent member in 2020 and 2021, our tagline was, friends of all, we strive for a better world. I believe the first person who wrote President Vladimir Putin a letter about, quote unquote, the special military operation in the Ukraine. I use that because that's the language which he calls it. The United Nations denounce it as aggression, which is the other word that I also would use. I was in Qatar. I was in Doha. I was listening on February the 24th, listening to the television. And when I saw this thing, I was so shocked. And I immediately wrote him, sent the letter to him. He responded through Foreign Minister Lavrov. I wrote President Biden, sorry. And recently I also wrote, because of another reason, the President of the People's Republic of China. we try to be very principled. We don't seek quarrels with people. We speak very, very forthrightly, but without any quest for confrontation. We have relations with the Republic of China, Taiwan. The representative is from that government is here. The United States of America has diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China, but Taiwan has an economic cultural office in several states in the US. We have diplomatic relations with the Republic of China, Taiwan. But we do not get in any campaign of an ideological kind against the People's Republic of China. We, for instance, hold a position, and you have to be creative, and you have to be clear. This is a big question in the world. When the mainland Chinese ask us, they say, well, would you have diplomatic relations with us? You have to drop relations with Taiwan. I say, but I can't set preconditions for you with your relations with anybody. You can't set preconditions with me. That's the first thing. I say, if you wish tomorrow morning for us to have relations with you while we have with Taiwan, we will have relations with you. We don't see a one China policy. We see a one Chinese civilization, which there are legitimate political expressions. There's one in China, mainland China. There's one in Taiwan. There's one in Singapore. Mainland China is a non-borrowing member of the Caribbean Development Bank. We are a borrowing member. We work with them in the Caribbean Development Bank. We work together in the World Bank. Mainland Chinese companies come to St. Vincent and win contracts financed by the World Bank or the Caribbean Development Bank. While at the same time, on another project, the Taiwanese companies which win contracts financed by banks or the government of Taiwan. It's fine with me. Look, the Chinese civilization is 6,000 years old. They have had a quarrel since 1949. If even they have a quarrel of that kind for 500 years, it would be less than 10% of their civilization. Do I think that I could sort out the problem between mainland China and Taiwan? Absolutely not. So why am I getting involved in that ideological battle or that confusion? But we have very loyal friendships with Taiwan and the relationships since 1981, when the founding father of independence established relations with Taiwan. And I don't see any reason to change it. I must be the only politician other than those in Beijing. I've read the 5 volumes of the selected works of Mao Zedong, published in 1965. I still have them by the Gang of 5 or the Gang of 4. I've read the volumes, the selected works of Deng Xiaoping. I've read the 2 volumes of the current chairman, the current leader in mainland China. I've read the volume in English, a thick volume of the founder of the Republic of China, Sun Yat-sen. I read the leaders of Taiwan. In just the same way that I read the founding fathers in the United States of America. I can't ignore 1.4 billion people in mainland China. I can't ignore them. Taiwan can't either. Taiwan, the major exporter, more than 40% of the foreign direct investment of Taiwan anywhere in the world is in mainland China. They do a lot of trading. They had a problem following Nancy Pelosi's visit. I went after Nancy Pelosi. It was organized long before. I didn't follow Nancy Pelosi. I happen, our visit was organized long before that. And I noticed that Taiwan, that mainland China, banned the export to them of 100 commodities. 100. And on the list, they banned potato chips from Taiwan. But I looked the 100 list down. They haven't banned computer chips. Because they need that. It's all right, you can ban potato chips, you can substitute something else, but computer chips. So I live in a real world. So you ask me, how do I do this? I do it by using my brain, analyzing, we discuss, we look at things critically, and we have a framework in which we address these issues. I don't interfere in the internal affairs of the People's Republic of China. And the Taiwanese respect me for that. They don't want me to do that. In fact, I wouldn't be a good friend to them if I set about doing that. Yeah. So and you've been open and honest. We have disagreements with the United States of America. For instance, the United States of America under Donald Trump. Well, first of all, under Barack Obama in February 2015, quietly issued an executive order saying that Venezuela is a threat to the national security of the United States. Well, that's absolutely laughable. A country of 27 million people could be a threat to the national security of 350 million with nuclear power, with nuclear weapons. It's ridiculous. I mean, it's an absurdity. But that was there so that, for whatever it's worth. No. Donald Trump came and he imposed sanctions. And these sanctions against Venezuela are unilateral, they're illegal, and they're unjust. And I say so. But more than that, they affect us adversely. Because under the Petro-Carib Agreement, we used to get a lot of benefits through the financing arrangement for oil, fuel. That's all at an end. We are indirectly victims of that those sanctions. With Russia, there are some countries that automatically say, okay, the United States of America says that this Russian vessel must be banned from coming, and you can't refuel them and all the rest of it. I say to my American friends, your sanctions are unilateral. If you want them to have automatic applicability in my country, go to the Security Council and have them approved. United Nations Security Council. If you think that there's a bad guy in a yacht, we have a mutual legal assistance treaty with the United States. Send the request through the mutual legal assistance treaty where there is a juridical system in our jurisdiction, and we will arrest that vessel if the legal authorities in our country, the independent legal authorities responding under the mutual legal assistance treaty. I give you all these various examples to show you how we function. And when I function like that, somebody says, well, do you have anything against the United States? I say, absolutely not. I'm following international law. And what am I going to have against the United States? I can't take up St. Vincent Grenadines and carry it to Vladivostok. It's where it is. On Saturday evening, there's a meet and greet I have in Brooklyn. The largest city of Vincentians anywhere in the world is Brooklyn. How can I ignore the United States? How can I not be friends with the United States? But there are people who have these strange, simplistic notions of the world. And they get themselves, they want me to fit into some preconceived model which they have. Well, I'm sorry. I'm not going there with them. I'm explaining to you what I'm doing and explaining the basis of it. And people respect you for that. And I'm not getting in your business. I will tell you this. Once, we are members of ALBA, the Bolivarian Alternative for Americas. A draft statement was made, was sent around to the ALBA countries. When you had this matter with Floyd, George Floyd, this black man who was killed by the police. And they were commenting on it. They wanted ALBA to make a statement on it. And I say, absolutely not. I'm not involving myself in that statement. And the reason being, I'll be interfering in the internal affairs of the United States of America. And the United States of America has institutional mechanisms to deal with whoever, if anybody did anything wrong to George Floyd. No. An NGO group in St. Vincent or in Jamaica can make a statement against it. The youth arm of my party can make a statement about it, but not the government of St. Vincent and Grenadines. Why am I interfering in the United States of America internal business? They have their own judicial system to deal with these problems. Thank you very much. And that's how so you ask me the question, I give you the broad theoretical perspective, and I give you multiple examples. And I understand somebody, a young academic from the Caribbean, somewhere at Syracuse or somewhere, somebody is telling me that they can't fit St. Vincent into something and our foreign policy confuse them. I'm sorry. I'm sorry if you're confused, ma'am. I'm doing what I'm doing with clarity. If you don't see it, please go and talk to me.
Back to Randall.
We'll take one last question and then we will go to book signing. We'll ask Sir Hilary to wrap up and we'll go to signing some books. Does that sound okay, Sir Hilary?
That's fine.
Lovely. One last question.
Good night, everyone. Prime Minister. I'm pleased to be closing this section out because the ambassador started with my question at the top end of this segment. You really had me looking on Google for the word Respair, and I wondered why. But I think you adequately answered that question. I also want to say I am an academic. I work I am involved in higher education, and I know of many of my colleagues that take sabbaticals to complete books, and you serve as a prime minister and still find the time to be able to write these books. I am not sure how you do it, but I just want to say that you are exceptionally talented to that extent. One of my question really though, relates to, as we Respair and we think of South-South cooperation, are we looking to Africa as part of the future and as part of our hope as we think of our commonalities as people of African descent and how we wage forward in the future?
The short answer is yes. And I've discussed that in part in the book. And I as you know, I've been calling for what I call the ABCD Commission, a permanent commission between Africa, Brazil, the Caribbean, and the diaspora. And we have made a first step in that regard with the CARICOM, African Union First Summit. And it's an area, I had discussions with President Kagame, who is the current head of the Commonwealth, political head, and with my brother, the president of Ghana.
Ado.
Yes. And we are talking about transportation and a number of other things. I don't know if you know this, even simple ways, which I'm I've given under an agreement with Ghana. They're helping us with cocoa and some other things. And four Ghanaian students are currently doing a Bachelor of Science degree in nursing in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, scholarships from our country. And we're building this and we're offering more because we'd like to do these mutual exchanges. I just want to say I'm working on something else, which will be a companion piece from a foreign policy standpoint to this, more detailed consideration. Very interesting. The United States of America, Europe, Russia, China, all the leaders have been saying that we need a new world order, each with its own peculiar agenda. So the title for what I'm working on now, the New World Order. What's new? Which world? And who gives the orders?
Well, a part of the answer to your question, where does the Prime Minister find the time? That question was once put to the late, great Rex Nettleford. And he said, it was very simple. I don't play cricket. And if you are a male in the Caribbean and you don't play cricket, you will find time to do many other things. And the Prime Minister has a constitutional duty to speak for his people. As a man of the people, reflected in his phenomenal electoral success, he speaks to the people and with the people. But to write a seminal work and to dedicate it to the citizens who are looking to the future despite all of the challenges. And I can tell you, St. Vincent and the Grenadines is a country with tremendous optimism. There's tremendous resilience born of a history. And that history has cascaded into the present. We have gone through the worst of times and the best of times are in front of us. And hence there's no despair. Thus, the paradigm of the title. I think we owe the Prime Minister a debt of gratitude for spending 2 hours with us to talk through the text and the context of the book and to take us into the future. Because as you have heard, the sequel is on its way. And hopefully we will gather here this time next year to discuss the sequel. But Prime Minister Gonsalves is worthy of our gratitude because it takes a tremendous amount of responsibility to be continuously so productive in the interests of social justice and the interests of economic development and economic growth. Prime Minister, we thank you.
Thank you.
As I said,
thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
We thank you and we appreciate your generosity here this evening.
Thank you very much, Hillary.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.